Elena and Lucas Hart's story is one of love, resilience, and profound loss. After years of struggling to conceive, they joyfully discover they are expecting twins, Aurora and Mason. However, their joy turns to heartbreak when they learn the twins are conjoined and share vital organs, making survival nearly impossible. Despite the risks, Elena chooses to continue the pregnancy, determined to give her children a chance to feel love. Aurora and Mason live for only 2 days, but their brief lives profoundly impact their parents. Through grief, Elena and Lucas find purpose, creating a foundation to support grieving families and sharing their story to inspire hope. What do you think about this story? Where are you watching from? Comment below to share your thoughts and connect with us. Don't forget to subscribe to DG Story for more heartfelt stories like this one. Spring in Cedar Ridge, a small town nestled in the heart of the Midwest, carried a gentle promise of renewal. The air was crisp, the fields bloomed with vibrant wildflowers, and the skies stretched endlessly, painted in hues of blue. In a modest house at the end of Maple Lane, Elena Hart stood by the kitchen window, absently caressing her belly. In the next room, her husband Lucas was busy assembling a crib, a skilled carpenter. Lucas believed every piece of wood had a story waiting to be told. This crib, however, was special, crafted with love and hope. It was for the twins they had longed for. "Elena," Lucas called out, his voice warm with amusement. "Do you think we should paint this white or light blue?" She turned to him with a soft smile, her hazel eyes glowing with happiness. "Light blue. It'll brighten the room. But don't you think we have plenty of time to decide?" Lucas chuckled. "It's never too early to prepare. I want everything to be perfect for the babies." Elena often reflected on the day she learned her dream of becoming a mother was finally coming true. After 5 long years of trying, filled with heartbreak and endless prayers, she had almost given up. Then, the miracle came. She could still hear the doctor's voice echoing in her mind. "Not just 1, but 2. You're having twins." The joy she felt in that moment had been overwhelming, tears streaming down her face as she looked at Lucas, who was equally stunned and overjoyed. "I can't believe it," Lucas had whispered, his deep blue eyes brimming with tears. "2 babies. Elena, we're going to need a bigger house. Maybe even a truck. We'll manage," she had replied, squeezing his hand tightly. "This is everything we've ever prayed for." Their days since had been filled with planning, dreaming, and preparing for the new additions to their family. Lucas often spoke of camping trips with the kids, teaching them how to fish and carve wood. Elena imagined summer afternoons spent tending a garden with them, her hands guiding theirs as they planted flowers. They debated names endlessly, each one imbued with personal meaning. Aurora and Lily, if they were girls; Mason and Finn, if they were boys. The 12-week ultrasound was supposed to be another joyful milestone. Elena lay on the exam table, Lucas gripping her hand as the sonographer moved the wand over her belly. The screen came alive with grainy images of the 2 tiny lives growing inside her. "There they are," the technician said, her tone cheerful. The sound of their rapid heartbeats filled the room, a rhythm that felt like music. "We can hear them," Lucas whispered, his smile wide and uncontainable. But then, the atmosphere shifted. The technician's movements grew slower, her cheerful demeanor replaced by a furrowed brow. "Let me step out for a moment," she said quickly, leaving the room. Elena's heart raced. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas didn't answer, his own concern evident in his eyes. Moments later, the doctor entered the room. His expression was calm but carried a weight of seriousness. He sat beside them, his gaze meeting Elena's. "Elena, Lucas," he began gently, "I need to tell you something difficult. Your twins are conjoined." Elena's world tilted. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. "Conjoined twins," the doctor continued, his voice steady but empathetic. "They share several vital organs. including parts of their liver and circulatory system. This significantly lowers their chances of survival. We'll need to run more tests to fully assess their condition. But I want you to be prepared. The drive home was silent. Elena stared out the window, her mind replaying the doctor's words. Her hands instinctively cradled her belly, as though shielding the lives growing inside her. Even if it's just for a moment, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't give up on them, Lucas. I won't. Lucas glanced at her, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. I understand, Elena, but we need to think about the risks. You mean everything to me. She turned to him, her eyes fierce with determination. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know this. If I can feel them, I can fight for them. He reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. Words failed him, but his touch carried the promise that he would stand by her, no matter the outcome. As they entered their home, Elena paused at the door to the nursery. The room, bathed in golden afternoon light, suddenly felt vast and empty. She closed her eyes, placing both hands on her belly. Aurora, Mason, she whispered softly. I'll fight for you, I promise. Elena sat at the kitchen table the next morning, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee cup that had long gone cold. Across from her, Lucas sipped his black coffee in silence. The lines of worry etched deeper into his face. The warmth and light that had once filled their home felt distant now, replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet. I think we should tell your mom, Lucas finally said, breaking the silence. Elena flinched. You know what she's going to say. She loves you. Lucas replied gently. She deserves to know. Elena sighed, her shoulders sagging. Margaret, her mother, was a formidable woman, practical to the core, with little tolerance for what she deemed reckless decisions. Telling her about the twins felt like inviting a storm into an already fragile space. Later that afternoon, Margaret arrived, her crisp navy coat and firm demeanor a sharp contrast to the vulnerability Elena was feeling. How's my daughter? Margaret asked, her tone warm but sharp eyes scanning Elena's face. I'm fine, Elena lied, forcing a smile. But the truth came out quickly as Margaret pressed for details about the pregnancy. When Elena finally told her about the twins and their condition, Margaret's expression shifted from surprise to alarm. Elena, she began, her voice low but firm. You need to think this through. This isn't just about the babies. It's about you, about your life. I am thinking it through. Elena shot back, her voice rising. They're my children, Mom. I'm not just going to give up on them. Margaret's eyes softened, but her tone remained resolute. You're risking your life for something that might not survive. Do you think that's fair to Lucas? To us? Elena's hands balled into fists. They're not just something. Mom, they're someone, and I won't abandon them. Margaret sighed heavily, shaking her head. I just don't want to lose you. Lucas stepped into the room, his presence calming the tension momentarily. We're still figuring everything out, he said diplomatically, placing a steadying hand on Elena's shoulder. But this is Elena's choice, and I'm standing by her. Margaret looked between them, her lips pressed into a thin line. I hope you're ready for what's coming, she said quietly before leaving, her words hanging in the air like an unspoken warning. Over the next week, Elena wrestled with an unbearable weight. The doctor's words, her mother's warnings, and Lucas's quiet worry all swirled in her mind. Each night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, one hand on her belly, feeling the faint movements of the twins. One evening, Lucas found her sitting on the nursery floor, surrounded by baby clothes she had been folding. Elena, he said softly, kneeling beside her. We need to talk. She didn't look at him. I already know what you're going to say. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. I want us to be realistic. The doctor said the chances are slim, and the risks to you are high. What if something happens to you? I can't. His voice broke, and he looked away, What if something happens to them? Elena interrupted, her voice trembling but resolute. What if they're the miracle we've been waiting for? Lucas, I can't live with myself if I don't give them a chance. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask of pain and frustration. Finally, he reached for her hand, his grip firm. Then we fight, together, whatever it takes. As if the strain of their private struggles wasn't enough, their situation became public in a way neither of them had anticipated. A week later, while Elena was at the grocery store, she ran into a neighbor, Karen, who had always been overly curious about others' lives. "How are you feeling, Elena?" Karen asked, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "I heard about the twins." Elena froze, her heart pounding. How did you hear about that?" "Oh, you know how it is in a small town," Karen said breezily, waving a hand. "People talk." By the time Elena returned home, her phone was buzzing with messages from acquaintances, offering everything from condolences to unsolicited advice. The following day, a local journalist called, asking for an interview. First, Elena refused, but after several persistent calls, she reluctantly agreed, hoping to control the narrative. The article was published the next week with the headline, "A Mother's Unwavering Love, Fighting for a Miracle Against All Odds." While some praised Elena as a symbol of courage, others were less kind. "This is reckless." One online comment read, "She's gambling with her life for babies who probably won't survive." Another said, "What about her husband? Her family? She's being selfish." Elena stopped reading after that. She slammed her laptop shut, her hands trembling. Lucas found her sitting in the nursery, her face buried in her hands. "What's wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "They think I'm selfish," she whispered. "They think I'm making the wrong choice." Lucas placed his hands on her shoulders, his voice steady. "Elena, listen to me. You're doing this because you love them, because you believe in them. That's not selfish. It's the farthest thing from it." Tears streamed down her face as she looked at him. "What if they're right?" "They're not," Lucas said firmly. "Even if it's just for a moment, you're giving them a chance. That's everything." That night, as Elena lay in bed, she placed her hands on her belly and whispered, "Aurora, Mason, we're gonna fight for you, no matter what anyone says." The air felt heavier in Cedar Ridge as Elena and Lucas faced the growing scrutiny from the world beyond their small town. While they had managed to keep their struggles private for a time, the article about their twins had changed everything. Elena could no longer walk through the grocery store or church without whispers following her. Friends she thought she could count on avoided her, while strangers approached her with unsolicited opinions. It was as if the whole town had taken sides in a debate about her life. "Ignore them," Lucas said one morning as they ate breakfast in silence. He could tell from her furrowed brow that she had been scrolling through online comments again. "I'm trying," Elena murmured, staring into her coffee. "But it's hard when people think I'm either a hero or a fool. There's no in-between." Lucas reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "We know the truth. That's all that matters." But the weight of public opinion continued to grow. One evening, as they sat on their porch, a car pulled up. A woman in her mid-30s stepped out, holding a small bouquet of daisies. Her face was drawn, her eyes tired but kind. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said hesitantly, "but I read the article about you. My name's Rachel." Elena glanced at Lucas, who gave a small nod before Elena replied, "It's fine. What can we do for you?" Rachel hesitated, clutching the daisies tightly. "I lost my daughter last year. She was born with a fatal condition, and I had to make the hardest decision of my life." Her voice cracked, and she took a deep breath. "I chose to let her go before she was born. I couldn't bear the thought of her suffering, even for a moment." Elena's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. I wanted to tell you that I admire your strength." Rachel continued, "But I also wanted to ask, Are you sure this is what's best? For them? For you? The question hit Elena like a wave, the doubt it carried threatening to pull her under. I don't know what's best, Elena admitted, her voice trembling. But I know I love them, and if there's even the slightest chance they can feel that love, I have to try. Rachel nodded slowly, her expression a mix of understanding and sorrow. I hope you find peace in whatever happens, she said before leaving. The public debate took another turn when a second article appeared in the local paper. This time, it was a scathing editorial questioning Elena and Lucas's choices. Should a mother risk her life for a fleeting hope? The headline read. The piece accused them of recklessness, suggesting that their decision would leave Lucas a widower and their community grieving an avoidable loss. Elena's phone buzzed constantly that day with messages from people both supporting and condemning her. Lucas finally took the phone from her and turned it off. That's enough, he said firmly. You don't need to read this garbage. Elena nodded, but her hands shook as she reached for her belly. Do you think they'll hate me, Lucas? If I can't save them? Lucas knelt beside her, his hands cupping her face. Elena, they will never hate you. They will feel your love, no matter what. That's all that matters. A few days later, their doctor, Dr. Myers, called with the results of additional tests. The twins are sharing more organs than we initially thought, Dr. Myers explained during their appointment. The liver, the lower digestive system, and part of the circulatory system. This makes separation impossible. Even if they make it to term, their survival will be brief and challenging. Elena listened quietly, her face pale but composed. Lucas, on the other hand, looked like he was barely holding himself together. What does this mean for Elena? Lucas asked, his voice tight. Dr. Myers hesitated. The strain on her body is increasing. Her blood pressure is rising, and there's a risk of preeclampsia. We're monitoring her closely, but it's important to prepare for early delivery. Elena placed a hand on Lucas's arm. We'll manage, she said softly. After the appointment, Lucas pulled the car into their driveway but didn't get out immediately. I can't keep doing this, he said, his voice breaking. Elena turned to him, her heart aching at the pain in his expression. I can't keep watching you suffer. Lucas continued. I don't want to lose you, Elena. I don't know how to stop feeling like I'm going to. Elena reached for his hand, her grip firm despite the trembling of her fingers. I don't want to lose you either, she said, but I need you to believe in me. I need you to believe in them. Lucas exhaled shakily, nodding. I'll try, he said, for you, for them. That night, as they lay in bed, Lucas turned to Elena in the dark. What if we did an interview? He asked. What? Elena asked, startled. With someone we trust, Lucas clarified. Let people hear our story, not from gossip or headlines, but from us. Elena hesitated, the idea making her uneasy, but then she thought of Rachel, of the mothers and fathers who might need to hear their truth. Okay, she said finally, let's do it. The morning of the interview dawned with a gray, overcast sky, as if nature itself was mirroring Elena's nerves. She sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Lucas paced the living room. Across from them sat Melanie Parker, a seasoned journalist from the regional paper who had come highly recommended for her empathetic approach to sensitive stories. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me, Melanie began, her tone warm but professional. I know this hasn't been easy. Elena nodded, taking a deep breath. We just want people to understand why we're doing this, why we're fighting for them. For the next hour, Elena and Lucas recounted their journey, the years of trying to conceive, the joy of learning they were expecting twins, and the devastating news of their condition. It's not about being brave, Elena said, her voice trembling but firm. It's about love. Even if our time with them is brief, we want them to feel that love, to know they were wanted. Melanie's questions were thoughtful, allowing them to share their perspective without feeling judged. By the end of the interview, Elena felt a weight lift, as though she had reclaimed her story. A week later, the article was published under the headline, "Fighting for a Moment, a Mother's Unwavering Love for Her Twins." The response was immediate. Letters poured in, some filled with words of encouragement and admiration, others laced with criticism and doubt. "This is so inspiring." One letter read, "Your strength gives me hope for my own struggles." But another was harsher. "You're gambling with your life and putting your husband through hell. This isn't love, it's selfishness." Elena tried to focus on the positive, but the negativity lingered in her mind like a shadow. A few days after the article's release, Elena woke up feeling unusually tired. Her head throbbed, and her vision blurred as she sat up. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. "Lucas!" she called weakly, panic rising in her chest. Lucas was by her side in an instant, his eyes wide with fear. "Elena, what's wrong?" I don't feel right," she murmured, clutching her head. Lucas wasted no time, scooping her into his arms and rushing her to the hospital. Dr. Myers met them in the emergency room, his expression grave as he examined Elena's symptoms. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high," he said, his tone urgent. "We're looking at severe preeclampsia. If we don't act soon, it could threaten both Elena's life and the twins." "What are our options?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with fear. "We need to deliver the babies," Dr. Myers replied. "They're at 28 weeks now, which is earlier than we'd like, but it's viable with intensive care. The longer we wait, the greater the risk to Elena and the twins." Elena, lying on the hospital bed, felt the words sink into her like lead. "What happens to them if they're born now?" she asked weakly. "They'll go straight to the NICU," Dr. Myers explained. "Their condition is already complex, but we'll do everything we can to give them a fighting chance." As they prepared for surgery, Lucas sat beside Elena, holding her hand tightly. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "if something happens to me, promise me you'll be there for them, even if it's just for a moment. I want them to feel your love." "Don't talk like that," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "Promise me," Elena insisted, her eyes locking onto his. Lucas swallowed hard, nodding. "I promise." The operating room was cold and sterile, the air filled with the hum of monitors and the quiet urgency of the medical team. Elena lay on the table, her body trembling not from fear, but from the enormity of what was about to happen. Lucas waited outside, pacing the hall like a caged animal. Every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, a nurse emerged. "Mr. Hart," she said gently, "the surgery is underway. We'll keep you updated." Inside the operating room, Elena fought to stay conscious, her thoughts consumed by Aurora and Mason. She pictured their tiny faces, imagined holding them, even if only for a fleeting moment. "You're doing great, Elena," Dr. Myers said, his voice steady. "Just hang in there a little longer." Moments later, the first cry pierced the air, thin and fragile but unmistakable. Aurora had arrived. "Baby one is out," a nurse announced, quickly wrapping Aurora in a blanket and rushing her to the NICU team waiting nearby. Seconds later, Mason followed, his cry softer but equally heart-wrenching. Elena's body weakened as the surgery continued. Dr. Myers worked quickly to control the bleeding, but the strain on her body was evident. "She's losing a lot of blood," a nurse said urgently. "Start a transfusion," Dr. Myers ordered, his focus unshaken. Meanwhile, Lucas was finally allowed into the NICU, where the twins lay in separate incubators. Wires and tubes surrounded their tiny bodies, and the sound of monitors filled the room. Lucas stood frozen, tears streaming down his face as he looked at them. They were impossibly small, their skin translucent, but they were alive. "You're so strong," he whispered, placing a hand on the glass of Aurora's incubator. "Just like your mom." Hours later, Elena was stabilized and brought to a recovery room. Lucas sat by her side, his hand clasped tightly around hers. "The twins are here," he said softly when her eyes fluttered open. "Are they okay?" she croaked. "They're fighting," Lucas said, his voice trembling. "Just like you." Elena managed a weak smile, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I want to see them. Soon," Lucas promised. But even as he spoke, he couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at his chest. He knew their fight was far from over. The NICU was a world unto itself, a maze of softly glowing incubators, rhythmic beeping monitors, and hushed conversations. Lucas wheeled Elena into the room the next morning, her face pale but her eyes wide with longing. Nurses and doctors moved with practiced precision, tending to the most fragile lives in the hospital. When they stopped at the two incubators marked Baby A and Baby B, Elena's breath caught in her throat. Aurora and Mason were impossibly small, their tiny bodies surrounded by wires and tubes that monitored every beat of their delicate hearts. "They're beautiful," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They are," Lucas said, his voice breaking as he placed a hand on her shoulder. A nurse approached, her expression kind but cautious. "Would you like to hold them?" she asked. Elena nodded, unable to speak. The nurses worked carefully, detangling wires and adjusting monitors until they could place both babies in Elena's arms. Aurora and Mason were nestled together, their shared body fitting perfectly into her embrace. Elena's heart swelled as she felt their warmth. Aurora stirred slightly, her tiny hand twitching, while Mason's breathing was steady but faint. "Hi, my loves," Elena murmured, her voice trembling. "It's Mommy." Lucas knelt beside her, his large hands gently cradling one of Aurora's hands, her fingers wrapped around his, so small and fragile but filled with life. "She's holding on to you," Elena said, smiling through her tears. "I think I'm the one holding on to her," Lucas replied, his voice cracking. They were allowed only a few minutes before the nurses carefully returned the babies to their incubators. As they arranged the wires and checked the monitors, Elena and Lucas watched in silence, their hearts aching with a mix of love and fear. As they were wheeled back to Elena's room, she placed a hand on Lucas's arm. "Even if this is all we get," she said softly, "it's enough. I just needed to hold them, to let them feel how much they're loved." Lucas nodded, though his throat was too tight to speak. Over the next 24 hours, the twins' condition remained fragile. Aurora seemed slightly stronger, her tiny movements giving the nurses a glimmer of hope. Mason, however, was quieter, his breathing more labored. Elena spent every waking moment in the NICU, her hand resting on the incubator as she whispered to them. Lucas joined her whenever he could, his presence steady and grounding. One evening, as the sun set and cast a golden glow through the hospital windows, a nurse brought a small portable speaker into the NICU. "Would you like to play some music for them?" she asked. Elena nodded, choosing a gentle lullaby she had often hummed during her pregnancy. The soft melody filled the room, wrapping around the tiny family like a warm embrace. But by the next morning, the fragile peace began to crack. When Elena and Lucas arrived at the NICU, they were greeted by Dr. Myers, whose expression was carefully composed. "The twins had a difficult night," he said, his tone gentle but serious. "Aurora's vitals are fluctuating, and Mason's breathing has weakened significantly. We're doing everything we can, but it's time to prepare for the possibility that they may not make it." Elena felt the air leave her lungs as she clutched Lucas's arm. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "They're still here. They're still fighting." Dr. Myers nodded. "Yes, they are, and we'll continue to fight for them as long as they're with us." That evening, Elena and Lucas sat beside the twins, holding their tiny hands and speaking softly to them. "I wish I could keep you both safe forever," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But no matter what happens, I want you to know how much you're loved." Lucas leaned in, his voice trembling. "You're our little warriors. We're so proud of you." As the hours passed, Mason's breathing grew shallower. A nurse gently approached, her face kind but somber. "Would you like to hold them again?" she asked. Elena and Lucas nodded, their hearts breaking as the nurses carefully placed the twins in their arms. Aurora and Mason were swaddled together, their shared body fitting snugly between their parents. Elena began to hum the lullaby again, her voice shaky but filled with warmth. "Hush, little baby, don't you cry." Mason's tiny chest rose and fell one last time, his breathing finally stilling. Elena let out a quiet sob, clutching him closer as Lucas buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with grief. Aurora stirred faintly, her tiny hand gripping Elena's finger one last time before her breathing slowed. "They know you're here," Lucas whispered, his voice breaking. "They know how much you love them." Elena pressed a kiss to each of their foreheads, her tears falling onto the soft blankets that swaddled them. "You can rest now, my loves," she whispered. "Mommy's here." As the nurses took the twins to prepare them for their final resting place, Elena and Lucas sat in silence, their arms wrapped around each other. The weight of their loss was crushing, but beneath it, there was a quiet peace. "They're together now," Elena said softly. Lucas nodded, his voice barely audible. "And they'll always be with us." The house on Maple Lane had never felt so quiet. The nursery door, once always open to let in sunlight and fresh air, was now firmly shut. The pastel walls and tiny clothes inside were no longer a source of joy but a painful reminder of what was lost. Elena spent her days moving through the house in a daze, her thoughts consumed by the image of Aurora and Mason's tiny faces. She could still feel their warmth in her arms, could still hear the faint lullaby she had sung to them. Lucas, on the other hand, buried himself in work. The hum of his tools in the garage became a constant sound, a desperate attempt to avoid the silence that now loomed over their home. One morning, Lucas found Elena sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Her eyes were hollow, and her shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the world. "Elena," Lucas said softly, pulling out a chair to sit beside her. "You can't keep shutting me out." "I'm not shutting you out," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you are," Lucas replied gently but firmly. "I know you're hurting. I am too, but we need to face this together." Elena's hands trembled as she set the mug down. "How?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How do we face this? Lucas, they're gone. Aurora and Mason are gone. And I don't know how to live with that." Her words hung in the air, raw and heavy. Lucas reached for her hand, his grip steady. "We remember them," he said. "We honor them. We let ourselves grieve. But we don't let the grief take away the love they brought into our lives." Elena finally met his gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't even know where to start." Lucas's voice softened. "We start by letting them stay in our hearts, not just in our pain." Later that day, Lucas suggested visiting the cemetery where Aurora and Mason had been laid to rest. First, Elena hesitated. The thought of standing over their graves felt unbearable, as if it would cement the reality of their loss. But Lucas gently urged her. "It might help," he said, "even just a little." The drive to the cemetery was silent, the familiar sights of Cedar Ridge passing by like a blur. When they arrived, Lucas helped Elena out of the car, his arm steadying her as they walked down the quiet path. The grave was simple but beautiful, marked by a small white stone engraved with their names, Aurora and Mason Hart, forever loved, forever remembered. Two delicate flowers, a daisy and a lily, were carved into the stone. Elena knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the names. The coolness of the stone sent a shiver through her, but she didn't pull away. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice catching. "I miss you both so much." Lucas stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "They were only with us for a short time," he said quietly, "but they changed our lives forever." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just wish I could hold them one more time." Lucas crouched beside her, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I think we'll always wish for that. But we gave them everything we could in the time we had. We gave them love." In the days that followed, Elena began to allow herself to grieve. It wasn't easy. Grief came in waves, sometimes as a dull ache, other times as a crushing tide that left her breathless. But she found solace in small rituals. She started writing letters to Aurora and Mason, pouring her heart onto the pages. "My sweet babies." One letter began, "I hope you can feel how much we love you. Even now, your daddy and I talk about you every day. We miss your tiny hands, your soft breaths, and the way you brought us so much joy in such a short time. You taught us what it means to love without limits. And for that, we will always be grateful." She placed the letters in a small wooden box Lucas had carved for her, keeping them close to her heart. Lucas, too, found his own ways to cope. He spent hours in his workshop crafting small wooden figurines, 2 tiny angels with wings outstretched. He placed them on the windowsill in the nursery, where the sunlight cast gentle shadows across the room. One evening, he invited Elena into the workshop. "I want to show you something," he said. Elena followed him, curious but hesitant. Inside, she saw a new project he had been working on. A small plaque with the words, "Forever loved, forever remembered. It's for their grave," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted something special for them." Elena ran her fingers over the smooth wood, tears welling in her eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. As weeks turned into months, Elena and Lucas began to find ways to reconnect. They attended a support group for parents who had lost children, sharing their story with others who understood their pain. At first, Elena was hesitant to speak, but as she listened to others share their experiences, she felt a sense of comfort she hadn't expected. When it was her turn, she took a deep breath. "Our twins, Aurora and Mason, only lived for 2 days, but in those 2 days, they taught us more about love and strength than I ever thought possible. They were fighters, and they made us better people just by being here." The group responded with quiet nods and murmurs of understanding. For the first time in a long while, Elena felt a flicker of light amidst the darkness. One afternoon, Elena stood before the nursery door, her hand resting on the doorknob. For months, she hadn't been able to step inside. But now, something inside her urged her to open the door. The room was exactly as they had left it. The crib Lucas had built stood by the window, the tiny clothes neatly folded on the dresser. Elena walked over and picked up a small onesie, holding it close to her chest. "You'll always be my babies," she whispered. Lucas found her there, sitting in the rocking chair. He knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her as they sat in quiet reflection. "We keep moving forward," Lucas said softly, "but we'll always carry them with us." Elena nodded, her tears falling silently. Always. Spring arrived with its gentle promise of renewal. But for Elena and Lucas, the ache of losing Aurora and Mason remained a quiet, constant presence. Yet, as the seasons changed, so did their grief. It no longer consumed them entirely but became a part of who they were, a bittersweet thread woven into the fabric of their lives. One morning, Elena sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. She watched as a sparrow flitted back and forth between the branches of a nearby tree, carrying twigs to build its nest. The simple act of creation struck her in a way she hadn't expected, filling her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. When Lucas came outside, she turned to him, her eyes brighter than he had seen in a long time. "I want to do something," she said, her voice steady. Lucas tilted his head, curiosity flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" "I want to help other families," Elena explained. "Families like us, parents who've had to make impossible choices or who've lost their children too soon. I want to share Aurora and Mason's story." Lucas set down his coffee, studying her carefully. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Elena nodded, her resolve clear. I don't think I'll ever stop missing them, but I don't want their lives to be defined by sadness. They taught us so much about love and strength. I want their legacy to be about hope. Elena began by reaching out to local support groups for grieving parents. She started small, writing letters to families who had recently experienced loss, sharing her own journey and offering resources that had helped her and Lucas. One day, she received an email from a woman named Lisa. I read about Aurora and Mason. The email began, "Your story gave me the strength to hold my daughter for as long as I could, even though I knew our time would be short. Thank you for sharing your journey. It made me feel less alone." Elena read the email twice, her heart swelling with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. She showed it to Lucas, who smiled softly. "They're already making a difference," he said. Elena nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "That's all I've ever wanted." With Lucas's support, Elena decided to organize a remembrance event for families who had lost children. She called it the Garden of Light, inspired by the small garden Lucas had planted in their yard in memory of Aurora and Mason. The event was held on a crisp spring afternoon in the local park. Families gathered, each bringing a small flower or candle to honor their lost loved ones. Elena stood at the front of the group, her hands trembling slightly as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion welling inside her. "When we lost our twins, Aurora and Mason, I thought the pain would break me, but through that pain, I discovered something unexpected, a strength I didn't know I had, and a community of people who reminded me that I wasn't alone." She paused, scanning the crowd, her eyes meeting those of parents who understood her pain all too well. "Our children may not be with us physically, but their love, their spirit, it stays with us." She continued, "Today, we honor them. We let their light guide us forward." The event was simple yet profoundly moving. Families shared stories of their children, some laughing through tears, others sitting quietly in reflection as candles flickered in the gathering dusk. Lucas had built a small wooden bench for the park, engraved with the words, "Forever loved, forever remembered." Elena and Lucas stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, watching as the candles cast a soft glow across the park. "They'd be proud of you," Lucas said softly, wrapping his arm around her. Elena leaned into him, her heart full despite the ache that lingered. "I hope so," she replied. As the months turned into years, Elena and Lucas continued their work, establishing a foundation in Aurora and Mason's name. The foundation provided resources and support to families navigating the loss of a child, helping them find hope and healing in their darkest moments. Elena began speaking at hospitals and conferences, sharing her story with medical professionals and parents alike. Her words were raw and honest, but always infused with a message of hope. "We can't change what happened," she often said, "but we can choose how we carry their memory. We can choose to let love guide us." Lucas supported her every step of the way, using his woodworking skills to create keepsakes for grieving families. Tiny boxes, picture frames, and memorial plaques, each one crafted with care and compassion. One afternoon, Elena received a call from a young couple who had just learned their unborn child had a fatal condition. The mother's voice was filled with fear and uncertainty. "We don't know what to do," she said, her voice breaking. "We're so scared." Elena listened intently, her heart aching for them. "I can't tell you what the right decision is," she said gently, "but I can tell you this: whatever you choose, your love for your child will shine through. They will feel it, no matter how brief their time is." The couple thanked her, their gratitude evident even through their tears. After the call ended, Elena sat in silence for a long time, her thoughts with Aurora and Mason. "They're still guiding us," she murmured to herself. One evening, as Elena and Lucas sat on the porch watching the stars, Lucas broke the silence. "Do you think they know?" he asked softly. Elena turned to him. "Know what?" "Aurora and Mason," he said, his voice full of quiet wonder. Do you think they know how much they've done? How many lives they've touched? Elena smiled, her eyes glistening. I think they do. I think they always knew. Lucas reached for her hand, his grip steady and warm. Together, they sat in quiet reflection, the stars above a reminder of the light that continued to shine, even in the darkest of times. The nursery on Maple Lane had changed over the years. What had once been a space filled with anticipation and dreams for Aurora and Mason now served as a sanctuary of remembrance. A desk stood where the crib used to be, covered with letters from families, photographs from remembrance events, and journals filled with Elena's thoughts. But one thing remained the same. On the windowsill sat two wooden angels Lucas had carved in the early days of their grief. Each morning, as the sunlight streamed through the window, their wings cast soft, golden shadows across the room, a quiet reminder of the love that still lingered. One spring morning, Elena walked into the room and ran her fingers along the smooth surface of the desk. She picked up a letter from a mother who had attended the Garden of Light event the previous year. Your story gave me the courage to hold my daughter for the precious hours she was with us. Those hours were the hardest of my life, but also the most beautiful. Thank you for helping me see that love, even in loss, is never wasted. Elena clutched the letter to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. Every word reminded her of Aurora and Mason, their legacy, their light, and the way they had transformed her life. Meanwhile, Lucas was in his workshop, sanding the edges of a small wooden box. Over the years, he had perfected his craft, creating keepsakes for families who had experienced loss. Each piece was unique, personalized with a name or a phrase that carried deep meaning. Today, he was working on a box for a couple who had recently lost their son, Jacob. The top of the box was engraved with the words, "Forever in our hearts." As Lucas polished the box, his thoughts drifted to the twins. He imagined them sitting on his workbench, their tiny hands reaching for the tools, their laughter filling the room. They'd be proud of you, Elena said from the doorway, interrupting his thoughts. Lucas looked up, startled but smiling. And they'd be proud of you, too. Elena had spent the past few months planning a new initiative through the foundation, a mentorship program for grieving parents. She envisioned a network of families supporting one another, sharing their stories and offering a shoulder to lean on. On the program's launch day, Elena and Lucas hosted a gathering at the park where the Garden of Light had first been held. This is about connection, Elena said as she addressed the group. When we lost Aurora and Mason, we felt like we were alone in our grief. But over time, we discovered a community of people who understood our pain and reminded us that we weren't alone. That's what this program is about. Finding strength in one another and honoring our children by sharing their light. As she spoke, Lucas stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The event was filled with quiet conversations, heartfelt hugs, and the soft glow of candles as the evening wore on. 1 week later, Elena received an unexpected invitation to speak at a national conference for medical professionals on pediatric loss. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she could bring herself to share her story on such a large stage. Lucas encouraged her. You've already touched so many lives. Elena, this is a chance to reach even more people, to honor Aurora and Mason in a way that lasts forever. With his support, Elena agreed. On the day of the conference, Elena stood backstage, her heart pounding as she clutched her notes. The room beyond was filled with hundreds of doctors, nurses, and parents, all waiting to hear her speak. When her name was announced, she took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. My name is Elena Hart, she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. And I'm here to share the story of my twins, Aurora and Mason. She spoke of their brief but powerful lives, of the love that had carried her and Lucas through their darkest days, and of the lessons they had learned about hope, resilience, and the enduring power of connection. I used to think that love was measured by time, she said, her voice breaking slightly. But Aurora and Mason taught me that love isn't about how long you have, It's about how deeply you feel it. They were only with us for 2 days, but those 2 days changed our lives forever. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Elena wiped her eyes as she stepped off the stage, her heart full of both sorrow and gratitude. That evening, as she and Lucas sat on the porch, the first stars appeared in the sky. "Do you think we're making a difference?" Elena asked softly. Lucas looked at her, his gaze steady. "I know we are." Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, her thoughts drifting to Aurora and Mason. She imagined them among the stars, their light shining down on the world. "They'll always be a part of us," she whispered. "Always." Lucas agreed, wrapping his arm around her. The nursery remained a sanctuary, but it no longer felt like a place of sorrow. It had become a space of love, filled with the echoes of Aurora and Mason's brief but meaningful lives. As Elena placed a fresh flower in a vase by the wooden angels, she smiled softly. Their story wasn't just about loss. It was about the light that followed. In every letter she wrote, every speech she gave, and every family she helped, Aurora and Mason lived on. Their legacy was one of love, resilience, and hope, a reminder that even the shortest lives can leave the deepest imprints on the world.